There were moments in every mother's life when the mathematics of survival became brutally simple, when love could only be measured by what you were willing to sacrifice, when protection meant choosing which pieces of your heart you could afford to break in order to save what remained. For Leora Ashworth, that moment came on a morning when frost painted her children's breath in silver clouds, and the last of their grain stores had been reduced to empty sacks that held nothing but the echo of better times. 27 years old and already worn thin by struggles that had aged her beyond her years, she knelt beside the cold hearth where no fire had burned for 3 days, listening to her children's quiet hunger with the kind of desperate clarity that came when all illusions about hope and eventual rescue had finally been stripped away by circumstances that recognized no appeals to fairness or divine. A Mercy, Elena, barely 5 years old, curled against her brother with the trusting faith of childhood that somehow their mother would find a way to make the emptiness in their bellies disappear. Marcus, 8, and already too wise about the cruel mathematics that governed their existence, watched his mother's face with eyes that held understanding no child should possess, comprehension that their situation had moved beyond difficult into territory where survival required choices that would leave permanent scars on everyone involved. Outside their tiny cottage on the outskirts of Packlands, winter pressed against the walls with patient hunger of its own, cold that seeped through gaps in timber that had never been properly sealed, wind that carried voices from the village center where pack members gathered around fires that burned bright with fuel they could afford to waste on comfort, rather than hoarding for basic survival. The message from the pack elders had arrived the previous evening, delivered by a beta whose expression held the kind of professional sympathy that characterized those whose job required delivering ultimatums to people who lacked resources for compliance. Payment for sanctuary and protection was due immediately. Grain stores, preserved meat, textile goods, or other forms of wealth that demonstrated continued value to the community, that had tolerated her presence among them for reasons that had more to do with ancient laws about abandoning Omega mothers than any genuine desire for her company. Payment she simply didn't possess, couldn't acquire, would never be able to provide regardless of how much time they granted for resolution of debts that had accumulated through years of struggling to maintain independence while raising children whose father had vanished the moment he learned of their existence. Which left only one option, the choice that every Omega mother dreaded but understood might eventually become necessary when survival demanded sacrifices that challenged the fundamental bonds that defined maternal love and protective instinct. The Alpha King's Court accepted children of appropriate bloodlines for training and service, positions that provided education, shelter, and opportunities that exceeded anything their current circumstances could offer. It was charity disguised as honor, mercy dressed in the formal language of royal patronage and divine benevolence. Her children could live, they could thrive, they could grow into adults who possessed skills and connections that would ensure their future prosperity and social acceptance. All it required was a mother brave enough to let them go, strong enough to choose their survival over her own desperate need to hold them close, wise enough to recognize that sometimes love meant accepting permanent separation in order to preserve what mattered most. Leora had always known this day might come, had prepared herself as much as any parent could for the mathematics that governed existence on the margins of pack society, where resources were scarce and tolerance was conditional, and survival often required decisions that challenged every instinct that defined maternal devotion. But knowing something was possible, and facing its actual implementation, were entirely different experiences, separated by the vast distance between theoretical understanding and the immediate physical reality of choosing to break your own heart in order to save your children's lives. The Alpha King's Court lay 3 days' journey through territory that tested even experienced travelers, across mountain passes that could kill the unprepared, and through forests where wolves hunted according to rules that recognized no appeal to mercy or circumstance. A journey she would make with her children in tow, carrying nothing but the desperate hope that royal magnanimity would extend to accepting gifts that came wrapped in a mother's sacrifice, and seasoned with the kind of love that could only be proven through ultimate surrender. She had no other choice, no other options, no other way to ensure that Elena and Marcus would live to see spring, would grow into adults who possessed opportunities she could never provide, would survive to remember their mother as someone who had loved them enough to let them go when holding on meant watching them slowly starve in circumstances that offered no possibility of improvement or escape. Tomorrow they would begin the journey to the Alpha King's Court, Tonight, Leora would hold her children close and memorize their faces, their voices, their scent, their warmth, everything she would need to sustain her through whatever years remained after she had given away the only things that made her existence meaningful. Because that was what mothers did when the world offered no good choices. They chose the option that preserved their children's futures, regardless of what it cost their own hearts to pay that price. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning they prepared to leave for the Alpha King's court, Leora's hand shook as she braided Elena's hair with the careful precision that had become ritual. One of the few maternal comforts she could still provide when everything else about their situation had been reduced to desperate improvisation and the cruel mathematics of survival. Her daughter sat perfectly still, sensing the gravity of what they were about to undertake, even if she couldn't fully comprehend the permanence that would define whatever happened next. "Where are we going, Mama?" Elena asked for the third time since dawn, her small voice carrying the kind of careful curiosity that marked children who had learned to read adult anxiety with accuracy that no 5-year-old should possess. "To see the king," Leora replied gently, securing the braid with a ribbon that had once belonged to her own mother, one of the few possessions that connected her to a life before single parenthood and the systematic grinding down that came with existing on the margins of pack society. "To ask him to take care of you and Marcus. Are you coming too?" Marcus interrupted from his position by the window, where he'd been watching the road with 8-year-old seriousness that spoke of understanding that went beyond his years. He knew, even if he couldn't articulate it properly, that their mother's plan involved sacrifices she wasn't explaining in detail. Leora's throat tightened around words that refused to emerge in forms that wouldn't terrify children who were already facing too much uncertainty for their young hearts to process comfortably. The truth was that she had no idea what would happen to her after the Alpha King accepted or rejected her children for court service. No plan beyond ensuring their immediate survival that took priority over every other consideration. "We'll see what the king decides," she said finally, which was honest without being complete. Acknowledgement that their futures had moved beyond her ability to control or predict, that they were embarking on a journey whose outcome would be determined by powers far beyond her influence or understanding. She packed their few remaining possessions with movements that felt mechanical, automatic, designed to prevent her mind from dwelling on the finality of closing their cottage door for what might be the last time. 3 sets of clothing, basic necessities for travel, the wooden toys Marcus had carved for Elena during long winter evenings when entertainment had to be created rather than purchased. Everything else, the furniture their father had built during the brief period when their family had seemed stable and prosperous, the garden tools she'd used to grow vegetables that supplemented their meager income, the books she'd been teaching the children to read despite pack traditions that considered literacy unnecessary for Omega children, would be left behind like artifacts of a life that never been as secure as she'd convinced herself to believe. The journey to the capital required travel through territories she'd never seen, across landscapes that tested even experienced travelers with terrain that could kill the unprepared, and weather that showed no mercy to those who underestimated its capacity for sudden, devastating change. But she'd studied maps at the village library during the few opportunities when her children had been cared for by neighbors who occasionally showed kindness to single mothers, struggling with circumstances that could befall any Omega who trusted the wrong Alpha with her heart and future. 3 days of walking if they maintained steady pace and encountered no significant obstacles. 3 nights of camping under stars that would judge whether her sacrifice was born of wisdom or desperation, whether she was saving her children or destroying her family through choices that felt inevitable, but might prove catastrophically wrong. They left their cottage as morning mist began lifting from fields where other pack members worked with the casual confidence of those whose survival was never in serious doubt, whose children would never face the kind of desperate hunger that forced impossible decisions about love and letting go. "Mama," Elena said as they reached the village boundary, her small hand gripping Leora's with strength that spoke of developing understanding about the significance of their journey. "Will you be sad if we stay with the king?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Innocence that cut straight through the careful emotional armor she'd been constructing around her heart to survive what came next. Elena's wide eyes held trust that her mother would somehow make everything work out properly, faith that adults could solve problems that seemed overwhelming to children who lacked the experience to recognize when situations had moved beyond repair. "I will miss you terribly," Leora replied truthfully, kneeling to meet her daughter's gaze with honesty that felt like the least she owed someone whose life was about to be transformed by decisions made without her consultation or consent. "But I will be happy knowing you're safe and fed and learning things that will help you grow into the strong, capable woman I know you'll become." "What about Marcus?" Elena asked with the kind of logical persistence that characterized children who approached complex situations by examining them one piece at a time. "Marcus will take care of you," Leora said, including her son in the conversation with a glance that conveyed responsibilities he was already preparing to accept despite his youth. "And you'll take care of each other, just like you always have." Marcus nodded with solemn acceptance that made her heart break a little more, 8-year-old shoulders straightening to bear burdens that should have been carried by adults with resources and options that she simply didn't possess. He understood, perhaps better than Elena, that their mother was making choices that required strength beyond what she could sustain indefinitely. The first day of travel passed in relative comfort, following well-maintained roads through territory that remained familiar despite her limited experience with journeys that extended beyond the immediate vicinity of their packlands. They encountered other travelers, merchants heading to market, messengers carrying communications between territorial administrators, families moving from one community to another in pursuit of opportunities that had eluded them in previous locations. But as they moved further from familiar territory and deeper into the wild lands that surrounded the capital, the roads became less traveled, and the terrain more challenging, requiring careful navigation through mountain passes, where weather could change without warning and wildlife operated according to rules that recognized no appeal to mercy or circumstance. By the second evening, Elena's energy was beginning to flag, despite her determined efforts to keep pace with longer strides, while Marcus had grown quiet in the way that marked children who were processing stress through internal mechanisms that adults often failed to recognize or address appropriately. "Are we almost there?" Elena asked as they made camp beside a stream that provided fresh water and some protection from wind that carried the sharp bite of altitude and approaching winter. "One more day," Leora assured her, gathering firewood that would provide warmth and light through hours that promised to test their endurance and resolve in ways she hoped her children weren't old enough to fully comprehend. That night, as her children slept huddled together for warmth under blankets that had been adequate for their cottage, but felt insufficient for wilderness camping, Leora stared at stars that seemed impossibly distant and indifferent to the human struggles that played out beneath their cold light. Tomorrow they would reach the capital. Tomorrow, she would kneel before the most powerful alpha in their known world and offer him the only gifts she possessed. Children whose value she prayed he would recognize despite their humble origins, and her complete lack of resources to negotiate from position of strength. Tomorrow, everything would change in ways she couldn't predict or control, following patterns that had been established by forces far beyond her understanding or influence. But tonight, she could still hold her children close, could still breathe in their scent, and memorize the sound of their breathing and treasure, the weight of their bodies pressed against hers in sleep, that spoke of trust and comfort that might not survive whatever transformations awaited them in the morning. The Alpha King's reputation preceded him like storm clouds gathering on distant horizons, stories of ruthless efficiency and cold judgment that prioritized practical considerations over emotional appeals, accounts of decisions that served the greater good regardless of individual suffering that might result from policies designed to strengthen the kingdom at the expense of personal convenience. She had no reason to expect mercy from someone whose position required making choices that affected thousands of lives, whose responsibilities transcended sympathy for individual circumstances that represented statistical inevitability rather than personal tragedy requiring divine intervention. But she had to try, had to believe that somewhere beneath the crown and royal authority existed someone who remembered what it felt like to protect the vulnerable, who understood the difference between weakness and the kind of strength that knelt before superior power in order to preserve what mattered most. Her children deserved that chance, deserved opportunities that exceeded anything their current circumstances could provide, futures that weren't limited by their mother's failures or the random cruelties that had shaped their early existence. Whatever it cost her personally to secure those opportunities, whatever price she had to pay to ensure their survival and prosperity, whatever sacrifices were required to transform their desperation into hope, she would pay gladly, completely, without reservation or regret, because that was what love looked like when the world offered no good choices, and survival required breaking your own heart in order to save what mattered more than your own happiness or comfort. Tomorrow would determine whether her sacrifice had been wise or foolish, whether the Alpha King possessed mercy that extended to Omega mothers who approached him with nothing to offer but children whose potential might exceed their humble origins. Tonight, she held them close and prepared to let them go. The capital city rose from the morning mist, like something from the fairy tales Leora had told her children during long winter nights, when stories were the only warmth they could afford. Massive walls of white stone stretched toward sky that seemed impossibly blue after days of gray mountain weather, while towers and spires reached upward with architectural ambition that spoke of resources beyond anything she had ever imagined existing in reality, rather than imagination. But the beauty that took her breath away also emphasized the vast distance between her circumstances and the world she was about to enter. The difference between someone who had spent years calculating whether she could afford enough firewood to last through winter and people who lived surrounded by luxury that existed for its own sake rather than serving practical necessities. "It's so big," Elena whispered, her small hand gripping Leora's with strength that spoke of growing anxiety about what they would encounter within walls that seemed designed to dwarf ordinary people and remind them of their insignificance compared to powers that operated according to rules beyond common understanding. "Remember your manners," Marcus said quietly to his sister, his 8-year-old wisdom already adapting to circumstances that required different behavior than what had been appropriate in their village setting. "Don't speak unless someone asks you a question, and always say, 'Your Grace' or 'Your Majesty' when talking to important people." Leora felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak at his careful preparation, at the way he was already accepting responsibilities that should have belonged to adults with experience navigating court politics and social hierarchies that could destroy the unwary through simple ignorance about proper etiquette and appropriate deference. The guards at the main gate wore armor that gleamed like mirrors, their weapons and equipment speaking of resources that prioritized function and appearance in equal measure. They examined Leora's simple travel papers with expressions that revealed nothing about their thoughts regarding a shabby Omega mother and her children requesting audience with the Alpha King himself. "State your business," commanded the senior guard, his tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy that managed to be both polite and clearly dismissive. "I seek audience with His Majesty regarding placement of my children in royal service," Leora replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the nervousness that made her stomach clench with anticipation of rejection that would leave them with no remaining options. The guards exchanged glances that suggested they encountered such requests regularly, though perhaps not from petitioners who appeared quite so desperate or poorly equipped to navigate the complex protocols that governed access to royal attention. "Wait here," instructed the senior guard, before disappearing into a guardhouse that was larger and better appointed than the cottage where her family had lived for the past 5 years. The wait stretched into what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, time measured by Elena's growing restlessness and Marcus's increasing tension as he observed their surroundings with the kind of analytical attention that had always marked his approach to new situations. When the guard returned, his expression carried surprise that suggested their request had received more serious consideration than he'd anticipated. "His Majesty will grant you audience," he announced, with tone that conveyed his own bewilderment at royal decision-making that exceeded his understanding. "Follow me, and remember that any breach of protocol will result in immediate expulsion from royal presence." They were escorted through courtyards that demonstrated wealth beyond imagination, past fountains that served no purpose except beauty, and gardens that existed solely for aesthetic pleasure rather than practical food production. Everything spoke of resources so abundant that necessity never influenced design decisions, where form could triumph over function, because basic survival had been assured beyond any possibility of threat or uncertainty. The throne room where they were eventually led exceeded even Leora's most ambitious mental preparations for royal grandeur. Ceilings that soared beyond easy measurement supported by columns that could have housed her entire village. Floors of polished stone that reflected light from windows designed to demonstrate that even illumination was subject to royal control and artistic vision. And at the center of this overwhelming display of power and wealth sat the Alpha King himself. Rhaegan Bloodmane was larger than life, in ways that had nothing to do with physical dimensions, though he was certainly impressive enough in purely material terms. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair and golden eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing of his own thoughts or reactions. He radiated authority that made the air itself feel different in his presence. But more than his appearance, it was the sense of absolute power that emanated from him like heat from a forge, the feeling that decisions made in this room could reshape reality for thousands of people who would never even know their fates had been determined by royal judgment that operated according to principles beyond their comprehension or influence. "Approach," he commanded, his voice carrying across the vast space with clarity that suggested he was accustomed to being heard and obeyed, regardless of distance or circumstances. Leora moved forward with her children flanking her, their footsteps echoing off surfaces that seemed designed to emphasize the importance of every sound made in royal presence. When they reached the prescribed distance from the throne, she dropped to her knees with movements that had been practiced during their journey, her children following her example with the kind of careful precision that spoke of understanding that mistakes in this setting could carry consequences beyond simple embarrassment. "Your Majesty," she began, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor while struggling to control her voice, despite the nervousness that made her throat tight with anxiety. "I come before you as a mother, seeking sanctuary for her children." "Look at me when you speak," the Alpha King commanded, his tone carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument or hesitation. She raised her eyes to meet his gaze, feeling the full weight of attention that seemed to examine not just her appearance, but her character, her motivations, her worthiness for whatever consideration he might choose to grant or withhold, based on assessment that was occurring beyond her ability to influence or understand. "Continue," he said simply, settling back in his throne with movements that suggested he was prepared to listen despite the vast difference in their relative positions and circumstances. "Your Majesty, I am Leora Ashworth, Omega of the Pinehaven Pack. These are my children, Elena, age 5, and Marcus, age 8. I have come to offer them for service in your court, where they might receive education and opportunities that I cannot provide through my own resources." The words felt like torn pieces of her heart, each syllable a small death that brought her closer to the moment when her children would no longer be hers to protect and cherish, and hold close during cold nights when warmth was more precious than gold. "And what of their father?" the Alpha King asked, his golden eyes studying her face with intensity that seemed designed to detect any deception or omission that might affect his understanding of their circumstances. "Gone, Your Majesty. He left when he learned of their existence and has not returned." The simple truth of abandonment that had shaped their entire existence, reduction of her romantic hopes and family dreams to practical reality that required single-parent survival skills she'd never expected to need. "His loss," the Alpha King said quietly, his tone carrying something that might have been approval or sympathy. "What skills do your children possess that would make them valuable additions to court life?" "Marcus reads and writes above his age level," she replied, pride overwhelming nervousness as she described accomplishments that had been achieved through her determination to provide education, despite pack traditions that considered literacy unnecessary for Omega children. "He has aptitude for mathematics and natural leadership abilities. Elena is quick to learn, well-behaved, and shows artistic talent that might be developed with proper instruction. And what do you offer in return for royal investment in their education and advancement?" The question she had dreaded, the moment when her complete lack of material resources would be revealed as inadequate foundation for requesting favors that typically required substantial payment or political advantage. "Nothing, Your Majesty," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible despite the perfect acoustics that carried every word to royal ears that had probably never heard such honest poverty confessed so directly. "I have nothing to offer, except my children's potential and my willingness to accept whatever terms you deem appropriate for their care." Silence stretched across the throne room like physical presence, broken only by the sound of breathing and the distant noise of court life continuing beyond walls that contained what might prove to be the most important conversation of their lives. "You would give up your children?" the Alpha King asked finally, his tone carrying something that felt dangerous despite its superficial calm. "Surrender them completely to royal custody and care?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The words tore from her throat like broken glass, admission of defeat that represented the only victory she could achieve under circumstances that offered no good choices and no possibility of maintaining their family unit while ensuring their survival. "Why?" The single word carried weight that demanded complete honesty, explanation that would either justify her request or reveal it as the desperate gamble of someone who had run out of alternatives, and was willing to break her own heart to preserve her children's futures. "Because I love them more than I love myself," she replied simply, raising her eyes to meet his gaze despite the tears that made her vision blur with emotion she could no longer contain. "Because their lives matter more than my happiness. Their futures matter more than my comfort. Their survival matters more than my need to hold them close." "Stand up," he commanded suddenly, rising from his throne with movements that radiated authority and purpose that seemed to fill the entire chamber with anticipation of decisions that would reshape their reality according to royal will and divine judgment. She rose unsteadily, her children beside her, all three of them facing the most powerful alpha in their known world, with nothing but hope and desperate love to sustain them through whatever verdict was about to be pronounced. "I have heard your request," the Alpha King announced, his voice carrying across the throne room with finality that suggested decisions had been reached that would prove irrevocable once spoken aloud. "And I render my judgment." The moment that would determine their futures stretched between them like bridge-spanning chasm, whose depths contained either salvation or destruction, depending entirely on royal mercy that operated according to principles beyond her understanding or influence. "I accept your children for court service and royal education," he declared, each word falling into silence that felt charged with transformation. "They will receive training appropriate to their abilities and circumstances, befitting their new status as wards of the crown." Relief flooded through her with force that nearly buckled her knees, gratitude so profound it felt like drowning in reverse, being pulled up from depths where she'd been holding her breath for so long, she'd forgotten what normal breathing felt like. But before she could fully process the magnitude of what he'd granted, the Alpha King continued with words that shattered her understanding of what she'd thought she was requesting. "However," he said, his golden eyes never leaving her face, "I will not separate children from a mother who loves them enough to make such a sacrifice. You will remain here as well, serving in whatever capacity your skills and circumstances permit." "Your Majesty, I don't understand," she stammered, confusion overwhelming relief as she struggled to comprehend generosity that exceeded every expectation she dared to nurture. "You offered me your children," he replied, with something that might have been amusement softening the harsh lines of royal authority. "I'm taking you too. All three of you will remain under royal protection, in royal service, as members of my household." The throne room tilted around her as the full implications of his decision penetrated consciousness that had been prepared for loss, but not for this kind of unexpected mercy that preserved rather than destroyed, that honored rather than dismissed, that recognized worth where she had expected only judgment. Her children would be safe, fed, educated, given opportunities she could never have provided. But more than that, they would remain together, remain a family despite circumstances that should have torn them apart permanently. The Alpha King had not simply accepted her sacrifice. He had transformed it into something else entirely. Recognition that sometimes the greatest strength came disguised as surrender, that love worthy of royal acknowledgement might be found in places where others saw only weakness and failure. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for gratitude that had no proper expression in any language she knew. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Thank me by proving worthy of the investment," he replied, but his tone carried warmth that had been absent during the formal proceedings, suggestion that royal judgment had found her acceptable for reasons that extended beyond simple mercy or political convenience. As guards approached to escort them to whatever quarters had been arranged for their new life, Leora felt the first genuine hope she'd experienced in years. Not the desperate kind that sustained people through impossibly difficult circumstances, but the steady confidence that came with recognizing that sometimes the world contained more goodness than survival taught you to expect. The Alpha King had not simply granted her request. He had exceeded it in ways that challenged every assumption she'd made about power and mercy, about royal judgment and divine intervention, about what became possible when love was brave enough to kneel before forces beyond its control in order to preserve what mattered most. Her children were safe. They were together. And somehow, against all odds and expectation, they were home. The quarters assigned to them within the royal wing exceeded anything Leora had ever imagined could exist outside of fairy tales, let alone be designated for their personal use. 3 connecting rooms with windows that overlooked gardens where flowers bloomed purely for beauty rather than practical purpose, furniture that had been crafted with attention to detail, that spoke of resources unlimited by necessity, warmth that flowed from sources that required no careful rationing of fuel or constant monitoring of consumption. Elena explored their new surroundings with the kind of wonder that transformed ordinary childhood curiosity into something approaching religious experience, touching surfaces that gleamed with polish, applied by servants whose only responsibility was maintaining perfection for its own sake, rather than serving practical necessity. "Mama, look," she called from the window that offered views of the capital stretching toward horizons that seemed impossibly distant, after years of existence confined to village boundaries and the immediate vicinity of their small cottage. "There are so many people, and they're all wearing beautiful clothes." Marcus approached their situation with characteristic analytical attention, examining details that revealed how thoroughly their circumstances had been transformed by royal decree that had elevated them from desperate poverty to proximity with power that operated according to rules completely foreign to their previous experience. "The servants keep bowing when they see us," he observed quietly, his 8-year-old wisdom already adapting to social dynamics that required different behavior than what had been appropriate in their former setting. "I think we're supposed to be important now." Important. The concept felt foreign to someone who had spent years learning to make herself invisible, who had survived through careful attention to avoiding notice from pack members whose tolerance was conditional, and whose patience with Omega Mothers was limited by practical considerations, rather than extended through genuine acceptance or respect. But their elevation to royal household status carried responsibilities that extended beyond simply accepting charity gracefully. Duties that would require learning customs and protocols that governed court life, according to traditions older than any individual participant, and more complex than survival skills that had sustained them through years of marginal existence. A soft knock at their door announced the arrival of someone whose clothing and demeanor immediately marked her as occupying position of authority within the household hierarchy that governed daily life around royal presence and preferences. "Lady Leora," the woman said with courtesy that felt genuine rather than perfunctory. "I am Margareta, head of household staff. His Majesty has instructed me to ensure your comfort and assist with your transition to court life. Lady Leora." The title felt as foreign as the silk gown that had been provided for her use, garments that transformed her appearance so completely that she barely recognized herself in mirrors that reflected back someone who looked capable of belonging in surroundings that still felt like elaborate dreams, rather than actual reality. "Thank you," she replied, uncertain about appropriate protocols for responding to kindness that came without obvious strings attached, or expectations that exceeded her ability to fulfill. "We're grateful for His Majesty's generosity. His Majesty rarely acts without good reason," Margareta observed with the kind of careful neutrality that characterized those whose positions required maintaining diplomatic balance between competing interests and complex political considerations. "Your children will begin their education tomorrow morning, while you will meet with the household administrator to discuss your role within court operations." Her role. Another foreign concept that required adjustment to circumstances where her value was being assessed, according to criteria that had nothing to do with her ability to stretch meager resources through careful rationing and creative problem-solving. "What kind of role?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer might reveal expectations that exceeded her qualifications or experience with anything beyond survival-focused domestic management. "That will be determined based on your skills and interests," Margareta replied diplomatically. "His Majesty believes in utilizing individual strengths rather than imposing arbitrary assignments that fail to recognize personal capabilities." Over the following days, Leora discovered that royal household management operated according to principles that prioritized efficiency and excellence rather than simple adequacy, where every task was performed with attention to detail that reflected standards maintained through generations of service to power that demanded perfection as basic expectation rather than exceptional achievement. Her children adapted to their new circumstances with resilience that amazed her, though perhaps she should have expected such flexibility from young minds that had already learned to navigate uncertainty and adapt to changes that challenged their understanding of how the world operated. Elena threw herself into her lessons with enthusiasm that transformed education from necessity into pleasure, discovering talents for languages and music that had been hidden beneath circumstances that offered no opportunity for development or expression. Marcus excelled in every subject presented to him, his natural intelligence finally receiving challenges appropriate to his capabilities rather than being constrained by pack traditions that considered advanced education unnecessary for Omega children. But more importantly than academic achievement, they were thriving physically in ways that emphasized how much their previous existence had been shaped by chronic stress about basic survival needs that no longer applied to their daily reality. Elena's face had filled out, losing the hollow look that had marked childhood spent wondering whether there would be enough food to satisfy genuine hunger rather than simply stave off starvation. Marcus moved with confidence that spoke of security, rather than the careful alertness that had characterized children who never knew when circumstances might change without warning. They were safe, fed, warm, protected by power that operated according to principles beyond their previous understanding, but clearly included them within its sphere of care and attention. For herself, Leora found adjustment more challenging than she had anticipated, though the difficulties had less to do with material comfort and more to do with psychological adaptation to circumstances that challenged every assumption she'd made about her own worth and capabilities. The household administrator, a stern but fair woman named Isabella, had assigned her to work with the Royal Library system, cataloging collections, assisting scholars with research projects, maintaining records that documented knowledge accumulated over centuries of royal patronage of learning and cultural preservation. Work that utilized literacy skills she'd never expected to have value beyond teaching her children basic reading and writing, intellectual capabilities that had been dismissed as inappropriate interests for someone whose social position was supposed to be defined by domestic service and reproduction rather than scholarly pursuits. "You have excellent organizational skills," Isabella observed during her first week of employment, reviewing work that had been completed with efficiency that surprised even Leora herself. "And your handwriting is quite elegant. Have you had formal training in manuscript preparation?" "No, ma'am. I taught myself to write by copying books I borrowed from the village library." The admission felt dangerous despite Isabella's obvious approval, revelation of self-education that violated pack expectations about appropriate behavior for Omega mothers who were supposed to focus exclusively on child-rearing and domestic management. "Remarkable," Isabella murmured, studying samples of her work with expressions that suggested genuine respect rather than condescending surprise. His Majesty was correct to recognize potential that others had overlooked. His Majesty had recognized potential. The phrase carried implications that challenged her understanding of why they had been accepted into royal household, suggesting that their elevation had been based on assessment of worth rather than simple charity extended to desperate petitioners who had exhausted other options. But the most significant challenge to her adjustment came not from work assignments or material comfort, but from increasing encounters with the Alpha King himself, meetings that occurred with frequency that seemed deliberate rather than coincidental. He appeared in the library during her work hours, ostensibly reviewing documents that required royal attention, but clearly observing her performance with interest that felt personal rather than administrative. Their conversations began with professional courtesy and gradually evolved into discussions that revealed intellectual compatibility she had never expected to discover with someone whose position placed him so far above her social rank. "You have thoughts about this treaty negotiation?" he asked one afternoon, indicating documents that outlined territorial disputes between neighboring packs, whose resolution required diplomatic skill rather than simple application of superior force. Only that both parties seemed to be arguing about surface issues while ignoring the underlying resource conflict that's actually driving their hostility, she replied carefully, uncertain whether honest analysis would be welcomed or interpreted as presumptuous overreach by someone whose opinion hadn't been specifically requested. "Explain," he commanded, settling into a chair that positioned him as listener rather than authority figure delivering judgment from elevated position. Her analysis of the situation, developed through careful reading and observation rather than formal training in diplomatic strategy, impressed him enough that subsequent encounters included increasingly complex discussions about governance, policy, and the practical challenges of managing diverse populations with competing interests and limited resources. "You see patterns that my trained advisors miss," he observed after a particularly lengthy conversation about agricultural policy and its relationship to pack loyalty during times of economic stress. "Your perspective is valuable." Valuable. The word resonated through consciousness that had been shaped by years of being told she possessed no worth beyond her capacity to bear and raise children, that her thoughts and opinions were irrelevant to decisions that affected her life and circumstances. But more disturbing than professional recognition was her growing awareness that their interactions were affecting her in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude for his generosity toward her family, and everything to do with personal attraction that violated every assumption she'd made about appropriate boundaries between royalty and former petitioners who owed their survival to royal mercy. He was brilliant, possessed of intelligence that operated on levels she found both intimidating and fascinating. He was powerful beyond anything she had ever encountered, authority that could reshape reality through simple expression of royal will. But beneath the crown and formal protocols, he was also someone whose conversation revealed depth and complexity that challenged her preconceptions about what kind of person could maintain position of absolute power without losing essential humanity. "You're troubled about something," he observed during one of their library conversations, golden eyes studying her face with attention that seemed designed to detect thoughts she was trying to keep hidden. "Your Majesty, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to express concerns that might be interpreted as inappropriate dissatisfaction with circumstances that exceeded her wildest hopes for their family's future. "Speak freely," he commanded gently. "I value honesty over flattery, truth over comfortable deception." "I don't understand why you've shown us such kindness," she admitted quietly, risking honesty that might reveal her to be as presumptuous as some court members clearly believed. "We came here with nothing to offer, no resources or connections that would justify royal investment in our welfare. Yet you've not only accepted my children, but elevated our entire family to positions that exceed anything I ever dared hope for." "Perhaps," he said, rising from his chair to move closer with movements that radiated controlled power and something else that made her breath catch, despite her attempts to maintain appropriate professional distance. "I recognized something worth preserving in a mother brave enough to sacrifice everything for her children's welfare. Many mothers would make the same choice," she protested, though his proximity was making it difficult to maintain coherent thought processes when her enhanced senses were responding to his scent and presence in ways that suggested her body understood things her mind was trying to deny. "Many mothers might claim they would make such choices," he corrected, his voice dropping to tones that seemed designed for private conversation rather than formal royal discourse. "Few would actually follow through with such sacrifice when faced with the reality of permanent separation from their children." His hand rose to cup her cheek with touch that felt gentle, despite the obvious strength that could have crushed her without effort, thumb brushing across skin that seemed to burn beneath contact that challenged every assumption she'd made about appropriate relationships between royal authority and subjects who existed entirely at his mercy. "Your Majesty," she whispered, though protest died in her throat, as golden eyes studied her face with intensity that suggested he was seeing her as woman rather than petitioner, as individual worthy of personal attention rather than recipient of charitable obligation. "Reagan," he corrected softly. "In private moments you may call me Reagan." The intimacy of using his given name felt dangerous, like stepping across boundaries that existed to protect people in her position from overestimating their importance to those whose attention could be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted. But before she could protest or establish safer emotional distance, his lips found hers with kiss that transformed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her place in his household, her value in his estimation, her future in surroundings that suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like the beginning of complications she was completely unprepared to navigate. When they finally separated, both breathing harder than library research typically required, Leora found herself staring into eyes that held warmth and desire that had nothing to do with royal duty or charitable obligation. "This changes everything," she whispered, though whether in warning or acknowledgement, she wasn't certain. "Everything changed the moment you knelt before my throne and offered your heart's blood for your children's welfare," he replied, his hand still cupping her face with touch that spoke of possession rather than casual affection. "I simply needed time to make you understand what I recognized immediately." "What did you recognize?" she asked, though part of her feared an answer that would challenge her ability to maintain emotional equilibrium in circumstances that were rapidly moving beyond her control or understanding. "That sometimes the most precious gifts come disguised as desperate pleas for help," he said simply. "That true strength often kneels before it rises to claim what it was always meant to possess." Around them, the library held its breath as though even the ancient books understood they were witnessing the beginning of something that would reshape more than just her personal circumstances, transformation that would ripple outward to affect court dynamics. political relationships, and the very nature of power when it chose to recognize worth that existed, independent of bloodline or social position. The poor single mother who had offered her children to save them was about to discover that sometimes surrendering everything was the first step toward gaining more than she had ever dared to imagine possible. But with that possibility came complications that would test every assumption she'd made about love, loyalty, and the price of accepting gifts that transformed recipients in ways that challenged their understanding of who they had been and who they might become under circumstances that demanded courage beyond simple survival. 3 years later, the coronation that elevated Leora Ashworth from desperate petitioner to Queen of the Northern Territories took place on a morning when spring sunshine painted the cathedral windows in colors that seemed designed to celebrate transformation rather than simply mark the passage of time. Yao, the same woman who had knelt before the Alpha King 3 years earlier, now stood beside him as equal partner in authority that governed territories spanning vast geographical areas and affecting hundreds of thousands of lives. But for all the pomp and ceremony that surrounded official recognition of what had been evolving privately for months, the moment that mattered most to Leora occurred not during the formal proceedings, but in the quiet minutes before dawn, when she stood on their private balcony watching her children practice sword forms in the courtyard below. Elena, now 8 and growing into grace that spoke of confidence born from security rather than fear, moved through her exercises with focus that would have seemed impossible in the hungry, anxious child who had once clung to her mother's hand during desperate journeys to uncertain destinations. Marcus, 11, and already showing signs of the leadership abilities that had caught Rhaegon's attention from their first meeting, instructed younger court children with patience that revealed character development that extended far beyond simple academic achievement. They were thriving not just physically but emotionally, growing into individuals whose potential was being nurtured rather than constrained by circumstances that recognized their worth, rather than dismissing their contributions as irrelevant to adult concerns about survival and social hierarchy. "Admiring your handiwork?" Rhaegon asked, emerging from their chambers to join her observation of morning training that had become routine rather than novelty in their transformed existence. "Admiring theirs," she corrected, leaning into warmth and strength that had become sanctuary rather than threat, comfort rather than intimidation. "They've worked so hard to adapt to everything we never prepared them for." "They had an excellent example," he observed, arms circling her waist with possessive tenderness that still felt miraculous after years of believing herself unworthy of such devoted attention from anyone, let alone someone whose position placed him among the most powerful individuals in their known world. The transformation that had elevated her from desperate single mother to royal consort had required adjustments that challenged every assumption she'd made about her capabilities and limitations, discoveries that revealed strengths she'd never known she possessed beneath survival skills that had sustained her through years of marginal existence. Court life had demanded learning protocols and customs that governed interactions with nobility, whose power could reshape her family's future through casual words or momentary displeasure. Political responsibilities had required developing diplomatic skills that balanced competing interests without compromising principles that defined her character and guided her decision-making. Most challenging had been accepting that her voice carried weight in royal council meetings, that her opinions about policy and governance were sought after and implemented rather than dismissed as inappropriate intrusion by someone whose social position should have limited her influence to domestic concerns and child-rearing responsibilities. "The agricultural reforms are showing positive results," she reported, reviewing documents that tracked improvements in food production and distribution systems throughout their territories. "Crop yields are up 15% compared to last year, and reports of hunger-related mortality have dropped to negligible levels." Policies that had been developed from her intimate understanding of what it meant to stretch inadequate resources through careful planning and creative problem-solving, initiatives that addressed root causes of poverty rather than simply managing its symptoms through charitable distribution of emergency aid. "The education expansion programs are equally successful," Rhaegon added, studying reports that documented increased literacy rates and skills development throughout populations that had previously been excluded from advanced learning opportunities. "Pack leaders are requesting additional teachers and resources to accommodate demand that exceeds our initial projections." Programs that had been inspired by her recognition that intelligence and capability existed in every social stratum that potential could be found in places where others saw only limitations imposed by circumstances, rather than inherent deficiencies that justified systematic exclusion from advancement opportunities. Together, they had implemented changes that transformed their territories from collection of competing factions focused on individual advancement into cooperative networks that prioritized collective prosperity and sustainable development over short-term gains achieved through exploitation of vulnerable populations. "Your Majesty," called a voice from the courtyard below, interrupting their private moment with formality that still felt surreal, despite years of adaptation to circumstances that had elevated her beyond anything she'd ever imagined possible. Isabella approached with the kind of urgent efficiency that marked important communications requiring immediate royal attention, documents that would likely determine policy affecting thousands of lives through decisions that had become routine rather than overwhelming responsibilities. "The delegation from the Eastern Territories has arrived for the trade negotiations," she announced, referring to diplomatic meetings that would establish economic relationships affecting prosperity throughout vast geographical areas. "They request audience at your convenience." "We'll receive them in the formal hall," Rhaegon decided, though his tone carried consultation rather than simple announcement, acknowledgement that decisions affecting their territories were made jointly rather than unilaterally imposed through traditional royal authority. As they prepared for meetings that would require careful balance of competing interests and complex political considerations, Leora found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them from desperate desperation to shared authority that operated according to principles neither of them could have anticipated 3 years earlier. The poor single mother who had offered her children to save them had discovered that sometimes sacrifice opened doors to possibilities that exceeded wildest hopes, that surrender could be transformed into strength when recognized by those wise enough to see beyond surface appearances to underlying worth that challenged conventional assumptions about power and its proper distribution. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, as they made their way toward responsibilities that would consume most of their day, with decisions that affected thousands of lives throughout territories that looked to them for leadership and guidance. "Regret what?" he asked, though the warmth in his golden eyes suggested he understood her question related to choices that had elevated an Omega mother from the margins of society to the center of political power and authority. "Taking on a family when you could have simply accepted my children and avoided the complications that come with elevating someone who lacks proper breeding or political connections," she clarified, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. "I regret nothing," he replied with conviction that carried finality beyond argument or doubt. "Taking you was the wisest decision I've ever made, both personally and politically. You've made me a better king and a better man. Even when I argue with your advisors and suggest policies they consider inappropriately progressive," she pressed, remembering recent council meetings where her initiatives had encountered resistance from nobles who preferred traditional approaches to governance that prioritized established hierarchies over innovative solutions. "Especially then," he said, stopping to face her with expression that combined love and respect in proportions that still amazed her, after years of adaptation to circumstances that had transformed not just her social position, but her understanding of her own worth and capabilities. "You remind us all that true strength serves others rather than demanding service, that genuine authority protects rather than exploits, that real power elevates rather than suppresses." As they entered the formal hall where diplomatic meetings would determine economic relationships affecting prosperity throughout their territories, Leora felt the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond personal happiness or family security to encompass obligations that affected countless lives depending on their wisdom and judgment. But rather than feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had undertaken together, she experienced the steady confidence that came from partnership, that balanced individual strengths while compensating for personal limitations through cooperation rather than competition. The desperate mother who had knelt before royal authority with nothing to offer but love and sacrifice had discovered that sometimes the most profound transformations occurred not through acquisition of power, but through recognition that strength took many forms, that worth existed, independent of traditional markers of success, that love expressed through surrender could be transformed into authority that served something greater than individual advancement or personal comfort. Her children were safe, educated, thriving in environments that nurtured their potential, rather than constraining their growth through limitations imposed by circumstances beyond their control. Her own abilities were being utilized to serve purposes that extended beyond simple survival to encompass responsibilities that challenged her to grow into roles she'd never imagined possible. And beside her stood someone whose recognition of her worth had elevated not just her personal circumstances, but her understanding of what became possible when power chose to honor sacrifice rather than exploit vulnerability, when authority recognized strength in forms that challenged conventional assumptions about leadership and its proper exercise. The poor single mother who had said, "Take my children," had discovered that sometimes the most generous hearts were found in places where others least expected to find them, that mercy could be transformed into justice when exercised by those wise enough to see beyond immediate circumstances to underlying potential that waited for proper recognition and appropriate cultivation. The Alpha King had answered, "I'll take you too," and in doing so had proven that sometimes the most powerful gifts were those that preserved rather than divided, that honored rather than exploited, that recognized worth where others saw only desperation, and transformed sacrifice into strength that served purposes greater than individual comfort or conventional expectation. Together, they ruled territories where strength served wisdom rather than demanding submission, where authority protected rather than oppressed, where power elevated rather than suppressed those who had been dismissed by others as unworthy of recognition or respect. It was not the future either of them could have predicted, but it was the one they had built together through choices that honored love over convenience, wisdom over tradition, and the kind of strength that knelt before it rose to claim what it had always been destined to possess. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.